This is Anthony from Supernal Magazine Australia, and we have Tony Nikolic from AFL Solicitors up in New South Wales. Thanks for joining us, Tony. It's great to see you after a few chats.
I appreciate for the invitation. Thank you.
That's good. Now, a lot of people won't know this yet, but you've put out an it's like 29 pages of what I would call very well researched information to give to the government about the current situation around COVID and lockdowns and all that sort of stuff. Let's start first with a little bit about who you are, and then we could go into why this letter was brought about, because it is pretty full on.
Yeah, I initially started with a degree in criminology and worked some time in a drug monitoring project in Australia for some time there, and then became a lawyer some years ago now. But and through my time as a lawyer, I managed to. I had a strong backbone for social justice and human rights. Although I studied criminology and those sorts of discipline, I just felt as though there was a lot of social justice issues that needed to be addressed, and I devoted a significant amount of my time, even through university, towards pro bono programs, helping the vulnerable in the community, so people suffering from mental health, domestic violence, children, obviously through that sort of a system where people were just sort of slipping through the cracks, one should say, excuse me. And so through that, and I developed further skills and went into work with a wonderful professor, now the late Professor Faunce at the ANU, Australian National University, and we published a book chapter in the International Handbook of Whistleblower Research, which A.J. Brown up there in Griffiths University is one of the lead authors. However, we contributed to global corporate conduct matters, of which tended to focus largely on the pharmaceutical industry, and that was really about the powers of whistleblower laws, things that we really don't have here in Australia in terms of effective whistleblower laws, allowing people to come forward and adequately get the protection of the law. And when I speak of the publication in the International Handbook of Whistleblower Research, it was largely had to do with the pharmaceutical industry being one of the largest and most prolifically litigated companies or corporations, multinational corporations around the world. And it wasn't there, and just to make it clear, I'm not anti-corporate or anything like, absolutely not, because there are very important medications out there that people rely on a daily basis. However, there are also some that get through and slip through the cracks under the premise that because we did okay here, everything else must be true here. And all we ask, or all I was asking for, is where is the oversight? And I think that is a balanced way of looking at how I came about what we're here for today, which is the letter. It's about bringing transparency to the matter.
Yeah, it seems to be a big word out there in the world at the moment, is transparency or lack thereof. So that's a pretty amazing story. I mean, just being able to deal with domestic violence and all the stuff that goes with that's pretty full on work.
So. Yeah, I see it in practice almost every day. So I do a lot of work in the criminal, family and human rights, and I've done coronial inquests and human rights such as death in custody cases. We worked on a very important case in Kalgoorlie with respect to the riots and the tragic death of Elijah Doherty in 2016, of which I still stay in contact with all the people from the Kalgoorlie community, and that was the Indigenous First Nations community, of which I have a great affinity towards, because they have been struggling for decades, and we see again. There's another community, and many communities, I should say, all around Australia, who are still experiencing some of the residual effects. We say a lot, but when you actually go into the communities, not much is really being done in terms of how to get a little bit of progress from the royal commissions that have occurred in that area. And we do see an increase of domestic violence and things in other areas, like I said, family law and things. So there's a lot to be done.
I think, look, I agree. And it's, unfortunately, it's a very sad state of affairs. And as we're going through these lockdowns, you up in New South, me down here in Melbourne, and we know from what we're seeing reported that domestic violence, unfortunately, mental health issues due to lockdowns has gone up. Kids' helplines are being contacted at, something like 200% levels compared to where they were a couple of years ago. So it is very, it's a very serious state of affairs. And I think too, when we talked the other day, you were really on the mark with, we're not denying the existence of anything here, but we're looking at the way it's all being moved. And so talk to us, how did this letter come about?
It essentially came about from a large amount of people coming forward from various industries around Australia. And I say around Australia, almost every state and territory citizen, and I'm not talking about every citizen in every state, I just want that to be very clear, but we have citizens from every state around Australia from many, many industries, so aged care, nursing, so we're talking frontline disability care, policing, corrective services, doctors, pilots, both fixed wing, rotary. We're talking lawyers, we're talking miners, we're talking bus drivers, we're talking tradesmen. You name the industry, real estate agents. They're very concerned about the future of this country insofar as saying that we're out there, we're writing letters, and we're not receiving a reply. And when it came to those people, they said, well, they've had enough, and we're being treated with contempt, really, because here we are, we're always asked every 3-4 years to vote, I want to do this, and they're receiving promises. And it came to a head where all these people said, well, where are those promises now? Like, we were told in June of 2020, no mandatory vaccines, and now we're being told that if we don't get this vaccine, we're going to be released from our job. And what can be done? And I'll be very frank with you, the people I have are crying. They're literally crying on the phone, and it's one of the saddest things we've got. And then we hear on the other side, I think we need to put a balance, because everything is balanced. It's not about saying there's a hoax out there or anything like that. And certainly, I also know there are arguments out there saying that, has the virus actually been isolated to the extent that it can actually be identified and addressed by targeted vaccine? Well, there are arguments out there saying yes, and some are saying no. And that brings us to why we're here now, which was, the letter was really there, to empower people with the facts that we are getting around the world. It's not there to scare people. It's not there to tell people, take the vaccine, don't take it. It's none of that. It's got nothing to do with that. It's got to do with empowering people with information, and then sending that and imparting that information upon the representatives who, apart from a very few, really have not responded to those people who have asked me to represent them, insofar as saying, can you write this letter, because we want answers. And quite frankly, we're not getting it, and they feel as though they're being treated with contempt. You do what we say when we say it. If you don't listen, we will beat you down. And really, when you actually see what happens in the context of, and I'm not over dramatising this, but there's a lot of coercion and practical compulsion in those sorts of orders. And forgive me for saying so, but it's almost what I hear on a daily basis in the family courts or the criminal courts, where a vulnerable mother with children is being subjected to very similar sorts of measures. Now, I'm not saying anything to over dramatise that, but people do have legitimate concerns that aren't being answered.
Yeah, and I think I think in the bigger picture, where the coercion's coming in and where the we're not making it mandatory. Oh, now we're making it less mandatory as possible or more mandatory as possible, and that sort of thing. I think spot on with that's creating a level of anxiousness and fear out in the community because they don't understand the level of complexity that's going on in the background.
Well, precisely.
Yeah, it is quite it is troubling. I mean, full stop. That's you are acting the same as we are with the magazine, trying to be balanced and give all views fair way, and so hopefully that'll help alleviate some of the fear out there in the community. But being told what you can and can't do, and when it comes to your own body, I think that's fairly important that you should.
Well, the very principle of informed consent, you cannot have informed consent that is mandatorily imposed. How do you put, metaphorically speaking, how do you put a gun to someone's head and say, sign this, and say, well, you signed it? I'm sorry about the graphic nature of it. I think from a legal perspective, remember, the informed consent is an obligation, okay? There's three key elements to it anyway. Of course, there are many other aspects to it, but the three basic elements are the legal obligation, the professional obligation, and the ethical obligation to get something from your patient. Now, if through those checks and balances that patient says to you, hey, I'm happy with the COVID vaccine, give him the COVID vaccine, that's fine. I don't see, and almost a lot of people are saying that to me, hey, if that's what we choose, let us make that choice. But if there are also antivirals out there, okay, and we do know, and I do have some doctor friends who actually mentioned some of the names of antivirals that have been around for decades. They've been around for decades. They didn't just pop up now. Yep. They were suppressed. And we need to come to understand why were they suppressed in circumstances where they had been around for decades. They were actually patented. One of them actually had a Nobel Prize attached to it for its capacity to treat in certain areas. Look, I'm not a doctor. I'm not going to give that sort of evidence, but all I can say to you is there are potentially life-saving drugs that weren't given to the people in favour of waiting for a vaccine. Now, that vaccine, there's a lot of anxiety around that vaccine for specific purposes, and they're not conspiratorial. I've laid out the facts. We know that they don't stop the virus, okay? They don't stop you from contracting the virus. They do not prevent the development of it, okay? And there's very other peculiar characteristics of those vaccines that really no one knows. So we don't only not have a complete picture of the short term, we certainly don't have the midterm because we're not at that stage, and we don't have the long term, and we're far from that stage. We have documents that are saying we really don't know what they do, and that's all the people are expressing. Why are you making me take something and saying that it's for the safety of the community? So, for instance, let me give you an example here. For the airports, all frontline who have the exposure to people coming off the planes, they're apparently at the highest risk. Well, of course they're going to be, because they're at the coalface of the first interaction coming into our ports. Now, it is very important. Make no mistake about it, it's very important that our quarantine and border services do control what comes in and what comes out. That's something that we've done for a long time, and Australia's been very good at managing those sorts of things. But when we say we're going to give someone a vaccine to stop, by way of mandatory, to stop something happening, when in fact it doesn't stop it. So that person can still come in. Those people can all be vaccinated. But that vaccine, we know, doesn't stop the transmission. So what is the purpose of the mandating vaccine in the first place? These are key questions. These are key questions that aren't being answered, and people want them answered, and quite frankly, no one's answering them.
Yeah, that's a good. That's exactly spot on, and again, well described. Because I think that's what most people are asking the question. They're saying, well, if it doesn't stop me from getting it, and it doesn't stop me from spreading it, and all right, it might lessen the symptoms, that there's no guarantee, then why? That makes an important point. Jumping back to informed consent, and we know that the government has just now given immunity to all doctors and anyone that actually is responsible for giving these injections. I can't help but feel as somebody in the community and just go, well, there's no recourse. What do we do? Because if a doctor doesn't say, and this is a theoretical, but if the doctor says, look, I know what's in it, I don't really understand it, they don't tell you that, they just say, yeah, I sort of know what's in it. You ask them and they say, yeah, it's safe. And then down the track, you have an adverse reaction that could be quite severe. It means you've got to, if my understanding is right, and I'm just clarifying this because I've been asked this question, but if I'm that's right, I have to actually try and sue the government for any sort of compensation because nobody else has taken responsibility. And we know the drug manufacturers have complete immunity. I'm on the right track there, aren't I? Does that make sense?
Look, it's to a lawyer that makes absolute sense, and I think to a doctor it makes sense, and it makes sense to many in the public. Although the level to which we rationalise it would be a little bit more complicated. I don't know the actual policy. I haven't seen the actual law or amendment with respect. So, in terms of, and I say this in general over this whole take or this interview is, look, it's not legal or medical advice. It's not, because every case needs to be taken on its individual merits. But in saying that, I haven't really seen the ins and outs of the actual plan. But if we talk generally and we speak generally,
that's all we're doing.
Yeah. If we talk generally from that perspective, then providing an indemnity to anyone or anything in these circumstances, I think is extremely risky, because that then opens up a Pandora's box of where do those indemnities then stop? What is involved in that indemnity? Okay, so my understanding, and again, I need to clarify the actual specifics of it, but my understanding is that there is a proposal that doctors will be indemnified for issuing the vaccine. But if you went to like one of those mass injection sites where they've got popped up, I don't believe, and I stand to be corrected, and I'm not here to alarm anyone or anything like that. I do need the facts on this, but I don't believe they fall within the indemnity provisions. Okay, so anyone lining up to get that may be something they need to look at. In terms of how we go about the indemnity moving forward, well, two things. One is, if they are injured, somebody is injured, and the indemnity kicks in, basically you'll be told, if you can prove that it is linked, and what we're seeing now with vaccine injuries is the difficulty at which you need to show that you're linked to that actual injury. Okay, so causation is a major factor in any legal case. Okay, give you an example. If I'm on 3 other medications, I take the vaccine 10 days later. Let's say I suffer some sort of a cardiac event. Myocarditis is a known side effect to one of these. Obviously, we don't know exactly the extent to which, but we do know extremely fit US Marines soon after taking this or being told to take this vaccine develop myocarditis, which is an inflammation of the heart. I don't know I'm sure someone else can tell you the medical side of that a little bit more than myself, but they developed that. But now let's assume that person had a history of a cardiac that was well managed and being managed, but now that person has a myocardial infarction and they have a heart attack, right? How do you prove that it was the drug that actually did that and it wasn't your history in circumstances which at the time prior to taking the vaccine, you had everything under control. Okay, take that to a court now. You're in court for a long time, and I'll almost assure you 99 to 98, 99%, perhaps. Let me be very, very, very cautious here and say 95% of Australia's population won't be able to sustain a court case of that nature. So you're blocked. Essentially, you're blocked. You're prohibited. That's one thing there, and that's sad. That's a stat. You either take what I give you or take us to court.
Yeah, I guess that's the thing. I think in this whole thing, and again, for anyone watching this, please know that this is not, that this is just your understanding, and it's not a professional opinion that you could take anywhere. So we must be very clear on that. But, I think in the process of the letter and the detail and everything else, you've had some responses. What's the next step? Where does it go from here to actually really have any sort of impact?
Well, the ideal step really is for the government to engage the communities, and as you would see from my letter, engaging the community. Don't do it through fear, because if we recall what happened at the outset of this, we were getting images in the mainstream media, that is, of people literally collapsing in the street, lockdown. Everyone gave that 2 weeks to flatten the curve, and then 2 weeks turned to 4 weeks. And here we are 18 months later being told, you know what, let's do a hard lockdown for 3 weeks. And in the process, people who are attending their places of employment are being told, well, if you don't get this vaccine, of which, sorry, we can't tell you whether, safety or effectiveness, but we do know from research from Israel and England, it's not very favourable at the moment at this stage, and that is the science. That is the science that's telling us that. Okay. Now we can get other views. So the whole idea here is to get these people in. Where is it going to head? That's up to the government. That's up to the government. I'm certainly not going to release, but I do think that what we do need is more people such as Supernal and larger media organisations present the facts.
Yes.
Both sides. Again, if you read my letter, I'm not saying someone's good or bad. I'm saying present the facts. Let the people see there are people dying and there are people not dying. Okay, we don't need to show emotional stories of someone on a ventilator, and that one commercial that they released quite recently of a young lady on a ventilator. Well, the science says that people of that age really don't experience, or at a minimal extent, unless they have significant comorbidities such as lung disease or heart disease or some other significant type of comorbidity, and then they are then infected with COVID by way of whether it's the Delta variant, which is a lot less fatal than the Alpha variant. But what it actually is, and Professor Dr. Nikolic from USA, who is one of the most extensively researched doctors, and he's a cardiologist in the USA, and he's written, I think, the most journals and publications in and around COVID and its impacts on patients. And he actually states that what we actually seen in that commercial was not a young person suffering from the effects of COVID. Now, this is his opinion, because someone of that age would typically have minimal effect. Rather, what we were seeing is someone who was experiencing the side effects associated to a vaccine with respect to the thrombosis. Okay, so blood clotting in the lungs and things like that. That's what, and he said, that's what I've actually experienced. He's not saying I read this in a journal. He's saying this is what I've seen in hospitals in the front lines.
Yeah. So real time stuff. Well, look, Tony, thank you for shedding some light on the letter. I would ask permission that we could put a link through for people to be able to read it, because I think it's important for them to see and realise that there are people out there doing their homework, doing their research, that aren't trying to frighten anybody. And they're just saying, these are the facts. This is there, that's there, and go go from there.
Absolutely right. And I think just on a final point, I'm not a political kind of guy. That's not what we do. It's not who we are. We've got people. We're saying, here are the facts. Let you decide. You can decide. You want to put on a mask, put it on. You want to inject, take it. But give us the facts. Don't just give us one unilateral message, because all that says is the media is acting as a marketing tool for the pharmaceutical companies.
Yep. No, I totally understand that. So totally understand that.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate your time.
I appreciate it.
Good luck with your lockdown. And
yeah, thanks. And you too.
Another 3 weeks.
And everyone stay safe out there and take care of yourselves.
Great message. Thank you very much, Tony. Appreciate it.
Take care. Cheers.